So which character in the Bible do you think had the best eyesight? Well, obviously, it was the first king of Israel. It's right in his name. He saw all. Alright everybody, I'm coming back at you with really terrible jokes, and to let you know that this video is just going to be on 1 Samuel. I know that I said I was going to try to slam both 1 and 2 Samuel into one video, and then I was like, wait a minute, why do I think this is going to work if, like, the ancient people that first, like, put all these stories on paper couldn't even get them in one set of scrolls? So this is your video on 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel comes right after the book of Ruth, which we talked about last week, and it tells the beginning of the stories of the kings of Israel. In the full canon of the books of the Bible, the stories of the kings of Israel come in 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and 1 and 2 Chronicles. Now, 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings kind of line right up, like they tell pretty linear stories all the way through. 1 and 2 Chronicles is another account of the kings of Israel from a different perspective. So when we get to Chronicles, we'll be talking about some of these same stories, but from a different viewpoint. We can break the book of 1 Samuel up into 3 separate parts based on the 3 main characters in these stories. Chapters 1 through 4 are all about the character of Eli, and Eli is kind of the person moving all the moving pieces. Eli is a priest at the temple in Shiloh, which is where the Ark of the Covenant was living before it eventually got moved to Jerusalem. Chapters 5 through 12 are all about the character of Samuel, and Samuel is, of course, the person that this book is named after. He is the next prophet up after Eli. Chapters 13 through 31, the end of 1 Samuel, is all about the character of Saul, the first king of Israel, and what happens during his reign. So let's start at the beginning. In chapter 1 of 1 Samuel, we meet Hannah. Now, Hannah is one of 2 wives of a man who's living near the Shiloh area, and Hannah really wants children because she doesn't have any, and the other wife does. This is a repeating story throughout the Bible. You often see it with like Rachel and Leah, right? The 2 wives of Jacob. One has children, one doesn't for a really long time. So one year, Hannah and her husband are going up to Shiloh to pray for a ritual and a yearly sacrifice, and they get there, and Hannah is just overcome. She's praying with her full heart in front of God about hoping for a son. Hannah promises God that if God will give her a son, she will dedicate that son to the work of the Lord, whatever that means. He will be somebody who is set apart. So Eli is the priest here in Shiloh, and Hannah is basically praying nearby. So this is what happens starting in verse 12. As Hannah continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying silently, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought that she was drunk. So Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine." But Hannah answered, "No, my lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my heart and soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation all this time." Then Eli answered, "Go in peace. The God of Israel grant the petition that you have made of him." And she said, "Let your servant find favor in your sight." And the woman went to her quarters and ate and drank with her husband, and her countenance was sad no longer. So after this little mix-up, God does grant Hannah a son, and she names him Samuel, which basically means the Lord hears. So Samuel gets a little older, he's at home with his parents, and finally he's old enough to go to Shiloh with his parents for the yearly festival, and Hannah takes him there and gives him over to the priest Eli to be essentially trained in the temple worship and to be a servant of God, just like she promised. In chapter 3, Samuel hears God calling him in the night, and even though he's a little kid, Eli believes him that he knows what's going on, and so we kind of get this first inkling of Samuel as somebody who is blessed. Unfortunately, what Samuel hears from God is that Eli, the priest, his sons are not great people, and God has chosen Samuel to be the next priest, which is kind of bummer news for Eli. In chapter 8, the people of Israel ask Samuel to give them a king. All the other people around them have kings. They want a king too. Samuel essentially says, you know what? If you have a king, you're going to have to pay taxes. You're going to have military service. God is probably not going to be speaking directly to the king, so it's going to be kind of a game of telephone. And the people are like, yeah, we know, but we still want a king. So Samuel hears from God that this new person, Saul, is going to be king, and Samuel goes out and finds Saul and essentially anoints him. But then when it comes time to make Saul king, Saul, he's like a kind of a good guy, but he seems kind of nervous, like he's got kind of a nervous personality. And when they try to crown him king, it turns out he's like hiding in the baggage in a back room because he's not really sure what's going to happen. But at the end of the day, Saul gets crowned king. He's the first king. Everybody's very excited. So in chapters 11 and 12, Saul, the first king, has these great military victories and some time passes, and Saul eventually has a family because in chapter 13, we meet Saul's son Jonathan. Jonathan is a little bit of a troublemaker. There's a period in which he is out to war with his father, and at one night he sneaks away with his one armor bearer, and they go and just start chaos in the Philistine camp, which eventually allows the Israelites to capture the Philistine army, and it's a big victory, but Jonathan just kind of isn't doing things the way they're supposed to be done. That's going to come back around pretty soon here in the next couple of chapters. We're going to hear more about Jonathan. In chapter 15, God tells Samuel to tell Saul that they have to go defeat the Amalekites, who are a group of people that were historically sort of the arch nemesis of, other than the Philistines, or the arch nemesis of the Israelites at the time. So Saul goes and he defeats the Amalekites, but he brings some of their cattle back to use as a sacrifice. Samuel gets really mad when he sees this because Saul was supposed to go and wipe everybody out and wipe everything out, and so Saul consults with God, and then God says, because you didn't follow the rules, Saul, you are not going to continue to be king because you can't seem to do what I'm telling you to do. It's kind of a confusing part of the story, and Saul feels really bad, and you kind of feel bad for him, but I guess that's just the way it goes, because in chapter 16, God tells Samuel to go out to anoint the new king, to go find the new king somewhere in the countryside. So Samuel goes out into the countryside, he meets with a man named Jesse from Bethlehem, and Jesse parades all of his sons in front of Samuel one at a time, and Samuel's like, not that one, not that one, not that one, and he gets through all of Jesse's sons, and he's like, well, there's supposed to be another one, are there more? Jesse says, yeah, I've got one more son, he's out taking care of the sheep, but he's the youngest, he's not very important, and Samuel says, bring him in anyways, and he gets in, and lo and behold, it's David, and Samuel anoints him and says, this is the future king of Israel. Now, just a little while later, we hear that the Spirit of God has left Saul and has now rested on David, but God also sends a spirit that torments Saul, and so Saul kind of has these, I guess we would think of them maybe as panic attacks, or there are some people that think of Saul as a good example of different personality disorders, but something is going on with Saul, and the only thing that calms him down is music. So David comes and he plays his lyre for Saul, and that calms him down. In verse 17, we get the famous story of David and Goliath. David goes to bring his brothers on the front lines against the Philistines. He goes to bring them some food, and he gets there, and he sees that this giant Goliath, this huge Philistine guy, has challenged anybody in Israel to single combat for, all the marbles. So David goes out, and he's like, yeah, I'll challenge him, and it's not, everything that David says is very much the Lord will do this, and I believe in the power of the Lord to do this. So you kind of get the sense of David as not a too big for his britches kind of guy, but just somebody who really trusts. So Saul says, if you're going to go fight this giant, you can wear my armor if you want to. And David's like, all right, I'll give it a shot. So David puts on all of Saul's armor, but we know from a little earlier in the story that Saul's kind of a tall dude, and so the armor doesn't quite fit, and David feels too weighed down. So he says, no, I'm just going to take my sling and a rock, and he goes out to fight Goliath with just his sling. And of course, we all know how this story ends. David swings his sling and hits Goliath in the forehead with a rock, which knocks him out. And then the bloodier part where David goes and cuts off Goliath's head and brings it back to Saul. So from then on, basically everybody is in love with David. He killed this giant. He basically won this huge battle with the Philistines. Saul starts to get a little bit jealous of all the attention David is getting. But in the meantime, the much more important story for us, the story of Jonathan and David, is now really starting to bloom. In 1 Samuel 18, verses 1, starting there, we get this story. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound up to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. So before we get any farther, I am officially naming Jonathan as our Queero of the Week. There are so many books and so much writing and so much art that has been depicting David and Jonathan and their relationship. It's amazing. I would recommend to you a book called The Love of David and Jonathan, Ideology, Text, and Reception by James E. Harding. I think that would be a good one if you want to learn more about this specific subject. So anyway, more things happen in chapter 18. Saul gets really jealous of David, tries to kill him with a spear, no big deal. Misses though, it's fine. Also, Saul tries to get rid of David by sending him out to collect 100 Philistine foreskins as a bride price so that David can become his son-in-law by marrying his daughter, and it's this whole like transactional relationship thing. But David doesn't die, everything's fine. Jonathan tries to intercede for David with Saul and tries to kind of say, hey, maybe don't kill this guy. He's been your main champion and everybody loves him. That would kind of be a bad move. And Saul says, you're right, I won't try to do it again. But then he totally does. In chapter 20, you really get the flourishing and blossoming of this relationship between David and Jonathan because, like, big stuff is on the line. In verse 1, we hear that David comes to Jonathan and says, what have I done? What is my guilt and what is my sin against your father that he is trying to take my life? Jonathan tries to kind of downplay it and say like, oh, I've talked to my dad, it's going to be okay. But David's like, no, it's not going to be okay. David says, your father knows that you like me and he thinks, do not let Jonathan know this or he will be grieved. But truly as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, there is but a step between me and death. So like the stakes are high, it's super romantic, but also scary. So they make this plan that Jonathan's going to signal David if it's okay to come back to the king's court or not. And they make this whole plan, and then Jonathan says in verse 13, may the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, show me the faithful love of the Lord. But if I die, never cut off your faithful love from my house, even if the Lord were to cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. Thus Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord seek out the enemies of David. Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own life. So Jonathan goes back to Saul's court and tries to sound out how things are going. But when he tells Saul that David has left, even though he doesn't tell him why David's left, Saul gets really, really angry. In verse 30, it says, then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives upon the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Now send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. And it's like there are two things going on there, right? Like Saul is specifically cursing Jonathan out because he's chosen David over the rest of his family. He's also cursing him out because he's jeopardizing the line of succession. But like the language here, there's so much shame language around it and around choosing David that like feels familiar to a lot of us. So in chapters 20 through 24, it's basically just David running from Saul, and like Saul is pursuing him, and there are times when David gets really, really close to Saul. There's a point where Saul goes into a cave to go to the bathroom, and David happens to be in that same cave, and David sneaks up and is like, oh, I could kill him and end this whole thing right now, but he can't do it. He won't do it. So he just like cuts off a little bit of Saul's cloak. And then as Saul is leaving, David runs out and says, look, I could have killed you. Look, I have the corner of your cloak, but I didn't. Can we end this feud? And Saul says, you're right. You're right. I shouldn't be doing this. This is all wrong. And then things go on again. And the same thing happens where Saul gets jealous and angry about this whole thing happening with Jonathan and David. And he pursues David, and like, it's just a whole thing. In chapter 25, we meet a woman named Abigail. David and his small army of rebels are hiding in the hills, and they come down at one point because there's a festival going on. And David says, my men and I have protected this little household from anybody else, so like, we've done you this service. Could we please have some food? And the guy, Nabal, who owns this household, says, no way. Why should we give you any food? We don't even know who you guys are. And David gets real mad and is like, oh, we're going to go and attack them. But then this woman, Abigail, Nabal's wife, realizes what's going on, and she goes out to David with all of this food, and she goes to David and she says, my husband's an idiot. I'm so sorry. Thank you for protecting our land and all of us. We really appreciate it. Here's a bunch of food. We know you're hungry. And David's like, oh, thank you so much. This is amazing. We were really hungry and really mad. That was kind of a bad move on your husband's part. So later on, Abigail tells Nabal how she basically saved everybody and how close they were to dying, and Nabal literally dies of fright. David finds out about this and kind of says, hey, Abigail, your husband's dead. You want to come be my wife? And she says yes, and so David takes her into his household. In the last two chapters, chapter 30 and 31, David fights some battles, he rescues some people, he's generally an all-around good guy, but in chapter 31, the Philistines finally take over where Saul is living, where Saul's court is, and Saul and his son Jonathan and his other brothers all die. And that's where we leave the end of 1 Samuel, is kind of on a bummer note. Like, we know that David is coming up, but also Jonathan is dead. So here's the question that I always want to ask. Why is this book important for LGBTQ plus Christians? And basically, I think it's important because we never get to hear stories of representation, right? And while I always want to be careful about not putting our own ideas on ancient people, like not saying, aha, Jonathan and David are gay, because, like, first of all, they didn't have that concept then, and also we don't want to totally take David's wives out of the picture, and, like, because Abigail was amazing, right? So it's complicated, but I think that the picture that we get of two men in love in this book is something that we like to skip over a lot. We like to talk about David and Goliath, we like to talk about David the shepherd boy, but we never get to talk about David, the person who was, like, infatuated in love with Jonathan, and Jonathan who loved him back just as much. And so I like this story, and I hope that we can hold it up as a love story in our particular tradition too, just like alongside all the other love stories. Huge thank you to the Patreon supporters who make these videos happen, including TK and Jean and Ben and Anita and Olivia, and you're all wonderful, and thank you so much. Don't forget, if you are a $5 or above patron supporter, you can get in on our Trans and Christian Discord server, where we get to talk about stuff and talk about our lives and what's going on in them, and it's really fun. Next week, I'll be back here to pick up right where this one left off as we talk about 2 Samuel, and we talk about, like, we've kind of seen, like, the highlights of the good parts of kingship, and 2 Samuel gives us some of the bad parts of kingship, and there's some really interesting stories about David in there that I'm excited to get into with you. So keep an eye out for these love stories that are kind of buried within Scripture, because they are there. So the key here is to keep reading, everybody.